Good morning, Year 12. We'll just go through this social influence mark scheme. The vast majority of these questions come from last summer's exam in 2019. So if you want more detail on the mark scheme, I can email it to you. I can also email you the examiner's report. But I've kind of reworded the mark scheme so it's a little more familiar, or in language that you're hopefully a little more familiar with than the actual mark scheme itself. Now, if you haven't done this assessment already, please make sure you have a go at these questions first. Do it without using your notes and under exam conditions. You're only self-assessing. I'm not going to be collecting any marks in, so it's only you who's going to benefit by doing this, because you can kind of see what parts are going to achieve your marks and which parts of your answer might not be relevant, and you can do the green pen as you normally would in school. Give yourself around 45 minutes to complete it. Normally you would only have half an hour to complete each one of these topics, because there are 4 on paper 1 and the exam lasts for 2 hours. But if you are typing this in, I know that you might not be as familiar with typing in your answers, so it gives you a little more time just to accommodate that, so that you can spend a little more time typing your answers in if your handwriting speed is a little bit quicker than your typing speed. There are all the questions. The only question that I've actually removed from the real exam was one about statistical analysis, and that's because we haven't done that yet. I always leave that to the end of year 12, beginning of year 13. So that will be something that we do complete hopefully soon. Once we've gone through psychopathology, that's when we go back to research methods. But I've included a research methods question there, explain what is meant by mundane realism, which is a kind of question that could appear, but it is completely made up for the purpose of this assessment. But we'll go through the answers to the questions. The first question: outline 2 explanations of resistance to social influence for 4 marks. Now, nationally, this was answered very well by students across the country, and I think that the reason that it was answered so well, it's a very open question. Now, the key word, the exam command word there, is outline. So outline means that we don't have to include any research. This is completely an AO1 question. So if you have referred to research in your answer, we can get rid of that straight away. So once you do your green pen or you go back to edit your answers, you might want to get rid of any research. It's okay to reference research. So it's okay to say we know from research, or research suggests that, which would be absolutely fine. But if you go into the detail and start explaining this person did this, or this psychologist used participants in this way, then unfortunately you're just wasting time, because it's only asking us to outline the explanations. So it's just testing your AO1, which is your knowledge and your understanding. Obviously, we need to include 2 explanations of resistance to social influence to get 4 marks. So it's going to be 2 marks per explanation. And it just says resistance to social influence. So we can talk about absolutely anything that we want. We don't have to refer to a specific type of social influence. So if you feel more comfortable talking about obedience or conformity to social roles, then you can pick which you feel most comfortable with. The vast majority of answers, I expect, will refer to obedience, because that is where the vast majority of research or variations into why people remain independent come from. So chances are that you have talked about obedience. Here's the possible explanations. Like I say, we don't need any research, so you can refer to locus of control. So if you refer to those with an internal locus of control are more likely to resist than those with an external locus of control, that'd get you 2 marks. If you just describe the fact that internal locus of control, these individuals feel more in control and therefore more responsible for their actions, that can also achieve you 2 marks. Again, we don't need to refer to any research. You just got to be really careful, because a lot of students, they write those with an external locus control are more likely to obey or to conform, and unfortunately you're not referring on resistance. So even though you are correct, the way that you've structured that sentence wouldn't achieve you any marks at all. You have to focus on those who are resisting or remaining independent. There's quite a lot of situational factors which can contribute to somebody resisting social influence, disobeying or not conforming to a group. So social support is probably the most likely. If you refer to seeing other people disobey or having social support who also do not conform to a majority, so referring to Milgram or Asher's findings, then that would be absolutely fine for 2 marks. Now, if you refer to social support 1 as an example for disobeying authority, so if we see somebody disobey, and then social support again whilst we do not conform to a majority, like in Solomon Asher's research, then that is 2 separate explanations. So you can achieve full marks by talking about 2 different variations of social support. The authority figure does not appear legitimate, so if you've referred to not being in a uniform or removing the setting, so the setting doesn't appear to be legitimate, such as the rundown office block in Milgram's research, then that would get you 2 marks. Proximity, if you're closer or you can see the consequences of your actions of following obedience, then you're likely to resist. That only applies to obedience, it doesn't apply to conformity. You might have used the words removal of buffers, which is absolutely fine, that's great terminology to use. Group size, this only applies to conformity and not for obedience. If the majority is smaller than 3, you're more likely to remain independent, so therefore you're more likely to resist. The ambiguity of the task, so if the task is more simple and less ambiguous, like Solomon Asher's just the first variation of lines, then you're more likely to remain independent, because we know as the task becomes more difficult, you're more likely to experience informational social influence. And the absence of the authority figure, if you refer to people more likely to resist social influence or the pressure to obey, if the authority figure is not present, then again you can score 2 marks. So chances are your answers will be full mark answers for that question. It's a nice easy one to start us off, nice easy one to get full marks on. The next question is actually a maths question, so it's nothing to do with social influence, it's just giving us the context of social influence for the numbers. In 1987, a survey of 1,000 young people found that 540 said they smoked cigarettes, while 460 said they did not. In 2017, a similar survey of another 1,000 young people found that 125 said that they smoked cigarettes, whilst 875 did not. Calculate the ratio of smokers to non-smokers in 2017, give your answer in the simplest form, and show your workings for 2 marks. So straight away, in this scenario, let's just get rid of that first sentence. We only are interested in these numbers here. So we have a sample of 1,000, and we need to work out the ratio of 125 to 875. Well, the correct answer is 1 to 7. So without showing your calculations, if you have wrote 1 to 7, then you will score full 2 marks, even though it does say show your workings. Now, I always refer to these kind of questions to my students, usually in year 13 when we're really focusing on learning our exam skills. Try to always show your calculations. Even in the mark scheme, it says we can award 2 marks as examiners if a student has just wrote the correct answer. I'm always a little bit nervous by the fact that in the question they say that you're expected to show your calculations, to show your workings. And I can imagine one year they will in the mark scheme say that full marks can only be awarded if the correct answer is also combined with the correct calculations and where the student shows their workings out. So as a method of good practice, always show your calculations, always show your workings out, even if it's just scribbled, even if you cross parts out that you're getting correct. If you show how you work this out to the examiner, it kind of guarantees that you'll get full marks, just in case one time they do change that. If you have wrote one of the following, which is a correct ratio but not in the simplest form, you can achieve 1 mark. So if you've said 5 to 35, 25 to 175, or 125 to 875, which is just literally using the numbers from the source, then again you can score 1 mark. Now, if you're struggling with this question and you're unsure about how to work it out in the simplest form, well, because we're trying to work out the ratio of 125 to 875, just simply divide 875 by 125. So divide the largest number by the smallest number. That will leave us with the answer of 7. So therefore, we know that the ratio is 1 to 7. The next question, question number 3. The survey shows that fewer people are smoking today than in 1987. Using your knowledge of social influence processes in social change, explain possible reasons for this changing behaviour. Now again, I've wrote there on our mark scheme that this question is very similar to the first question. No research is required. It's demonstrating your understanding of the processes that are involved in social change. Again, you can refer to research findings, but you don't want to go into detail. So if you said Moscovici found that a consistent minority is important in the process of social change, then that's absolutely fine. However, if you then start talking about Moscovici's procedure, you've gone off task. But this is slightly different because it's an application question. All these marks are A or 2, which means that we have to continuously talk about the context of smoking. If we just answer or write generic answers relating just to social change, you won't score any marks. So this is one where you often get students feeling really confident that, yeah, I've wrote a really good answer because they've talked in a lot of detail and used the correct terminology for social change, but because they haven't done it specifically to the context of smoking, they score very few marks. And they're quite surprised generally when they get their answer back and it's so low. So just please make sure that your answer is referring to the context of smoking. So things that you could talk about, minority influence. Well, we can see that in 1987, the non-smokers were the minority compared to the smokers, and then that changes in 2017. So you could refer to anti-smoking groups or health campaigns being the minority, or the non-smokers being the minority, and the fact that they remain consistent with their argument, they are committed, or that they are flexible, demonstrates key fundamental processes that Moscovici showed us that can start to influence the majority and make the majority start to experience cognitive dissonance. So the consistency can refer to the same health campaigns being promoted. It could be the flexibility by trying to encourage people, maybe not to give up straight away, stop smoking altogether, but maybe start to adapt and reduce the amount that they're smoking, maybe start to use patches or vaping, I suppose would be the more modern example, to demonstrate that they're doing this with the best intentions and they're not just trying to be dogmatic in their view that you shouldn't smoke at all. You can refer to the snowball effect. So it starts off as very small, then all of a sudden the minority will start to snowball in their numbers, and eventually the minority will become the majority. We do have the key term of social cryptomnesia. However, because this question is asking for the processes involved, social cryptomnesia is not a process that's involved in social change. So unfortunately, that wouldn't score any marks for this question. So even though it is a correct key term, it's not involved in the actual processes. So we'll leave that one out. You could refer to conformity. So normative social influence. So as more and more younger people do not smoke, those who do smoke then start to go against the group. So in 2017, because the smokers are the minority, most people just conform to the majority who do not smoke. So therefore they're violating social norms. They might feel that they risk being excluded if they do smoke. You could refer to informational social influence and internalization. So now we're far more aware of the evidence and the damaging and negative effects of smoking. So therefore that makes us think, well, actually, the doctors, the health campaigners, they must be correct in what they're saying, that smoking is so dangerous. So therefore I won't smoke for those reasons. You could also, which is probably unlikely in our answers, but you could refer to obedience. So we know that in 2005, I think it was, 2005, 2006, the laws changed around smoking. So you can't now smoke in public places. You could argue that the age in which you can buy cigarettes has changed, and therefore we are more likely to obey the instructions of the law and the police officers, the legitimate authority figures, and not smoke at all. Now this is a bigger question. It's 6 marks, so you would just see which of these bands you feel that your answer is most likely to fit in. Just read the key terms there with regards to your application and the terminology used. These kind of questions is generally where it's better that somebody else reads your answer, because then they can be a little more objective with the level that they fit it in at. We'll get on to question number 4. Discuss ethical issues in social influence research for 8 marks. Now, I remember our students from Holy Family coming out of the exam room last year and being delighted that this question was asked, because there are so many ethical issues in social influence research, and a lot of them were beaming the fact that this was 8 marks, and the vast majority said, oh yeah, I've got 8 marks there in the bag. It appears to be a really easy question for 8 marks, however, it's more difficult than it first seems. So the exam command word discuss means that you've got to engage with the ethical issue and not just identify the ethical issue. So when we're saying engage with the ethical issue, you've got to say whether it's good or whether it's bad, rather than just identifying the issue itself. So I'll just read you a little comment from the examiner's report. This question was not generally done well. So that's nationally, that's not for our students, but students tended to focus too much on describing actual ethical issues, which were often given in overwhelming detail, and not enough on discussing various relevant aspects. So if we have a look at the question for discuss ethical issues for 8 marks, 3 marks are awarded for AO1, so that's your knowledge of ethical issues in the context of social influence research, and then the vast majority, the 5 marks, are actually for the discussion. So you're going to receive more marks for actually discussing and saying whether or not these ethical issues are good or bad, rather than actually just identifying the ethical issues. We're going to start by marking the AO1, but if you just have a look at the AO1 in the context of the question, you can't just identify ethical issues, it has to be in social influence research, so we must refer to some of the studies and why they might have ethical issues involved in them. So these are the 3 most likely ethical issues. So deception or lack of consent. So you would achieve 1 mark by referring to deception or lack of consent, but you also must refer to Milgram and Ash, or potentially Milgram and Ash, or one of the studies. You can't refer to Zimbardo because Zimbardo had complete consent from his participants. But we know that Milgram and Ash both used deception as part of their research. So Milgram informed his participants that they were studying, that their study was involved in memory, whereas Ash said that his study was for perception. So if you say that that is an ethical issue and you link it to Milgram or Ash, you will achieve marks. We also know there's ethical issues of protection. So Milgram, Ash and Zimbardo were all criticised for lacking protection from psychological harm of their participants. Go into a little more detail rather than just name dropping. So Milgram and Ash asked each of their participants showed visible signs of distress. Whilst in Zimbardo's study, we know that the prisoners experienced high levels of psychological and physical abuse. So you might go into detail with individual participants, such as the individual who went on hunger strike. So you could say that's a significant ethical issue. Also, the fact of withdrawal. So studies such as Milgram and Zimbardo were criticised for not making it clear to participants that they could stop the experiment and withdraw from the study. I've put there in the mark scheme, you've got to be really careful with how you word this, because Milgram and Zimbardo did allow participants to withdraw from their study. We know that because not all participants in Milgram's study went up to 450 volts. And we also know that Zimbardo's, some of his participants did withdraw from the study early. So we just say that they didn't make it clear that you could withdraw, rather than they did not allow you to withdraw, because you might get some examiners who really hold that against you and not award you full marks. Now I've put there, you don't need to talk about all of those points to achieve full marks. So if you've only talked about deception and consent and protection and not withdrawal, then that's absolutely fine. You can still get full 3 marks for doing that. There's a breadth-depth trade-off. So you can either talk about all 3 in not as much detail, or you might want to just focus on one, such as withdrawal, and go into a lot of detail in your application and explain why that's such an issue in studies such as Milgram and Zimbardo. Your AO3, this is where we're trying to achieve 5 marks. This is where most students lost marks. Most students across the country didn't achieve any marks for discussing these ethical issues. Now the first discussion, most common, without deception, a lot of these studies couldn't have taken place because participants would have been aware of the purpose of the study and therefore not behaved naturally. So they would have experienced demand characteristics. So for instance, if the participants in Milgram's study knew that the electrocution or the electric shocks weren't real, then they would not necessarily behave naturally as they would have done they would be aware that they're taking part in a study, probably guess the aim of the research, and therefore either disobeyed at a much earlier stage during the experiment, or potentially carried on all the way to 450 volts knowing that they weren't actually hurting anyone. So you can refer to that key term demand characteristics, or you could just say reduce the validity of the findings. You could also refer and compare Milgram and Ash to Zimbardo's study, because Zimbardo had their full consent, and we also know that in Zimbardo's study, one of the guards, who was referred to as John Wayne, actually admitted experiencing demand characteristics and saying, I kind of now regret that I behaved the way that I did, because I thought the purpose of the experiment was to demonstrate how horrific prisons were. Then you could do that to really start to develop that AO3 point and achieve high marks. The second point that you could refer to is debrief. So even though people like Milgram and Ash didn't have consent, they did use their debrief effectively. So they asked all the participants at the end of the research whether or not they were happy to take part, and they all agreed that they were. It also gave the researchers the opportunity to explain the behaviour to the participants, that they are natural. So conforming to a majority or obeying a legitimate authority figure is normal, and they haven't done anything wrong. They're not strange or bizarre, weird people. It also allows them to deal with issues of protection, so they can ask any questions, the participants can ask any questions, or they can provide support that might be required as a result of the psychological harm and distress that has been caused through the actual experiment. So there you're kind of saying that there were strengths, even though that they haven't got the consent, you're discussing it by saying they resolve that with a debrief. You could talk about other forms of consent. So Milgram in particular used presumptive and retrospective consent. So I've already mentioned retrospective. That's just where you ask the participants after the study, are you glad you took part in the research? Are you glad you consented? Presumptive consent. So Milgram asked other individuals who were similar to the participants in his obedience study whether or not they thought it would be acceptable. They agreed, so therefore Milgram presumed that his sample would also agree. Ethical guidelines. We've mentioned this in the past, that these studies did pass ethics because the ethical guidelines surrounding research within psychology were really lax and they were really weak. Following Zimbardo's research in particular, ethical committees became much more strict. Following Zimbardo's study, the Stanford Prison Experiment, the APA, the American Psychological Association, then established the first set of rigid guidelines that all psychological research must follow in America. And since then, other countries such as Britain, with the British Psychological Society, have also done the same. Now, if it wasn't for Zimbardo breaking those ethical guidelines, now in hindsight, we might not have these really strict and rigorous ethical guidelines that are helping support research. So we could say that something has really beneficial come from Zimbardo's research by him breaking ethics or having so many ethical issues in his research. And the final 2 points that you could refer to in your discussion is the cost-benefit analysis. So the benefit of the findings outweighs the damage caused by the study. So you could refer to Zimbardo's findings have resulted in prison reform. Or you could refer to Milgram's research explaining that people like what happened in the Second World War in Germany, the German civilians, they are normal people. There weren't anything wrong, particularly evil or bad about Germans. They were just following orders as most normal people would do. So the actual benefits of these results could be more significant than the ethical issues that were a result of the study themselves. Another cost of benefit analysis, you could say findings from people like Milgram and Ash have significantly influenced the development of other areas of social psychology. So again, the results are being so significant and important, and therefore the benefits of conducting the research and breaking the ethical or experiencing so many ethical issues was ultimately worth it. And again, this is one of these questions where you have to decide which band your answer falls in. We have 4 levels now because it's an 8-mark question. So again, it's the discussion part which is most significant. You've got to really try and expand. However, even in the top band, it says argument is sometimes lacking detail. So you don't have to produce a perfect answer to get to that top band level 4, as long as you are discussing those ethical issues. And the final question, I said at the start, this was a kind of made up question. Explain what is meant by mundane realism. Refer to one study into social influence in your explanation. So it's a research method question, but again, we have that application part there that we have to refer to at least one study. So there's the definition. Mundane realism refers to the degree or extent in which the materials and procedures involved in an experiment are realistic to the real world. You could expand on that to get our elaboration mark. Lacking mundane realism will reduce the validity of the findings. And then we need our application. I've gone into quite a lot of detail here with the application. You don't need to go into as much detail. But Milgram was significantly criticised for lacking mundane realism because he created the electrocution machine. It had never been used or seen before. You could argue that that is not realistic to explain everyday obedience. So how can we explain that the participants would behave the same with a gun in their hand compared to this electrocution machine? We're familiar with what a gun does. We know the harm that is caused by a gun compared to this machine, which was built purposefully for his study and nothing else. So hopefully all of those questions make sense. If you're really stuck, then just email me and I'll try and give you a little more specific feedback. You don't have to email your answers to me. Because I can't control the exam conditions that these are being set in, there's not much that I can do with these assessments and these grades. When we return to school, we will do an assessment for social influence now we've finished the topic. So you will have the opportunity to do it under test conditions, hopefully before the summer. If not, it'll be in the kind of first week that we return back to school. But don't worry, we'll do a little bit of revision beforehand in class together to make sure that there's no gaps. Okay, thank you very much.